What's up? I'm DJ, and today I'm going to show you how I turned a piece of scrap Indian rosewood or acacia, I don't know, into a set of coasters into a Makita track saw. Now obviously I didn't trade coasters straight up for a Makita track saw, but this was part of a deal that I worked out with my buddy John at Amick Woodworks. So to start out, I have this piece of scrap wood laying around, and just the way it warped would have made it pretty much useless for anything using the full size of the slab. So I decided to cut it down. I started out by using my crosscut sled to get a good straight edge on each side. I just wanted to get all of this stuff somewhat down to a rough size before I brought it over to the CNC to level, so that I made the most of the stock that I had on hand. Now that I have a relatively straight edge, I'm going to take it over and run it again through the table saw using the fence this time to rip it down to about 4.5 inches, and you'll just see the way this Amick Prestige blade with the carbide tips just rips through this thing and it's nothing. I changed my old blade out for this new one just a little bit ago, and honestly it's made such a huge difference. Highly recommend you check it out. There's a link to it in the description below. To help preserve stock thickness on this particular piece that I'm running through the crosscut sled right now, you can see there's one portion where it starts to taper a little bit and it gets below that 4.5 inches of what I wanted for our rough stock. So I'm going to trim that piece off, just because with how it warped, it would have meant thinner stock overall if I had left it that same length and then brought it over to the CNC to level. So right here I am using a double-sided rug tape. I got it from Lowe's, but I put a link to one that's very similar in the description, and this is very helpful for when you're trying to level stock, even if it's slightly uneven. Like right here I actually put a popsicle stick in, you can see there, to help keep it level. I'm just kind of holding it while I did that first slot cut, because obviously it's a full load on that CNC bit, so it's going to push that stock around a little bit more, but I just let the CNC do its thing and get this stock level. Now, I don't have a bandsaw, so using my table saw to resaw these boards was really the best thing that I could do. I will say that I did make a mistake here, and I should have used a feather board on the leading edge of the blade. However, using a table saw and anything in the shop really is all about how comfortable you are and how you can do things safely. I knew that I had over 1/2 inch of stock on the outside, which is why I was comfortable putting my hands where I did. And I also knew the max blade height was not going to come up above and get my hands up top. But if you're not comfortable with it, don't do it. After I resawed them, I brought these pieces over to the drum sander to get rid of those resaw lines down the middle and some of the machining lines on the other side. Ran it through a couple times, and then you'll see when I shut it down here, there's something I'm not really stoked about with this Performax 1632 drum sander. And when I turn it off, you can see how much that cantilevered drum on top moved, and it's just a testament to how much flexibility there is in this machine. It does pretty well, but you'll notice that I try to run every single piece through the exact same side because of that shutter right there, and knowing that it's going to flex and give me different thicknesses. Now that I have the stock down to the thickness I want uniformly, I bring it over and I'm going to do individual pieces on this, just because this carve is going to be so small. The easiest way to probably make these coasters would have been to cut all of these out on the CNC into circles and then jig it up in a laser to run it through probably 6 at a time. However, my laser's not working, so we're making the best with the tools we have, like a lot of what I do. After I get it cut down to the right size, I take it over just to hit it with some 220 grit. My drum sander is 150, and it left some parallel lines going down from sanding, so I brought the Festool Rotex sander out to get rid of those. And you'll see some of these pieces have a little bit of a mistake in there from the machining, a deep groove down one side. That was my fault. I let the program run incorrectly, but those are going to be mine. And just look at how this finish comes out after I use the air compressor to spray off that extra dust, and I just hit it with a coat of Minwax lacquer. I prefer Deft, but Minwax works just the same. In this scene, I'm going through and choosing the side that I want to be face up and giving it just a very light sanding with 220 grit by hand, just to get rid of dust nibs and give our contact paper that I use for a stencil a better surface to adhere to. Now, this is all about making these out of scrap, so I'm trying to use as little material as I can that's not just scrap I have laying around. So I'm using multiple pieces of this contact paper, stuff that I would probably not use on other signs, but because these are so small, it makes it easy to lay them all out, cut it down, lay it out again, cut it down, and you'll see on this last piece, the coaster up top here, that I put the stencil on, I use just 3 or 4 little pieces. This is always the most satisfying part of laying down stencils, is carving out the excess on the outside. Just make sure you're extra careful with a knife, as obviously it's very sharp and it will cut you. But now that I get all of these trimmed down and ready to go, we're just about ready to CNC. Now I use my Dog River Tools touch probe to get my Amana 45-degree bit set. This first path, as you saw from the little preview there, is going to go through and get all of the details and then clear out where my follow-on bit, a 1/8 inch flat end mill, cannot reach. Now at this point, I go into CNCJS, my CAM program, and turn my feed rate down 20%, just to make sure I'm getting all the detail I wanted. I didn't quite like how fast my feed rate was. So this portion of the carve and the date right below it is the reason I went with a more acute bit like the 45-degree versus a 90-degree, because it allows me to get the detail. And you'll see here I missed just a couple of those little lines in there. So I went back with one more pass and I dropped it down 0.3 of an inch. But at this point I am done with my V-carve toolpath. So I'm running some macros in CNCJS to set my 0 to be the same for my flat end mill as my V-carve end mill. Now before I start the pocket toolpath on here, I wanted to go through and just remove some of this stencil material. You don't really have to, but it prevents coming off the bit just a little bit. I took this pass in just one pass. Because this is only down, I believe it was 0.05 inches or 0.025, I can't remember off the top of my head. Now I go into my contour toolpath to actually cut out the shape. And you'll see I had one pass that was above the level of the stock, and that was just to make sure that I wasn't going to hit my clamps. Now I go through right when I finish and clean up all of this mess because I don't want to cause any static issues. Now you'll notice that there were 2 different forms of this coaster. One was for John's company, Amick Woodworks, and then the other is for his wife Emily's company, Wood, Wine, and Craft. So this is just a shot of carving the second one for Emily. Their design's definitely a little simpler. However, I did get tripped up a little bit here with the stencil, and you'll see on some of the detailed carves of the leaves, the stencil kind of came off in the middle of the leaf. It's not a huge deal, we just make sure we remove that before we paint it so it doesn't prevent any of the color from getting in there, and it just adds a little sanding at the end, so not a huge deal. on the contour toolpath, you'll see here at the end, I left just a sliver of wood below that. I basically zeroed the bit on the wasteboard below the level of the stock, and then brought it up 2/100ths of an inch. That way, it left me just a little onion skin on there, and you'll see I just bent it off to get the rest of it off there. This just makes it easier. I don't like using tabs quite as much because then it leaves some marking on the side of it. I used a flush trim bit to clean up the edge, and then brought it over where I rolled 2 of them up to conserve my painter's tape a little bit, and then cut it in half with a pocket knife. Something I like to do before I spray color on wood, especially if I haven't worked with them much before, is to hit them with a coat of lacquer. I use a lacquer clear and then a lacquer colored paint on these because it doesn't require any sanding between. Now you'll see on this colored pass, I go through and hit it from each side, and that's because with this carve, you're not going to hit everything from an angle, and it's really hard to spray just straight down. So I hit it from all 4 sides, and then once that paint is dried, I come over, rip off the blue painter's tape on the outside, which you'll see this painter's tape prevented me from having to sand any of the sides of this, just save a little work. I use this little scraper tool to come in and remove the stencil in the easiest way possible. I've really had issues with these leaving residue lately, and I think it's time to make the jump to Aura Mask, though I really didn't want to pay that much, and you'll see the residue on there. So the easiest way I found to sand small things like this is to flip my Festool sander upside down. It rests pretty well on its back, just holding it with one hand. And then I use the other hand to run my pieces through, and you'll see I'm kind of checking on each pass with the sander to make sure I'm not sanding any of the detail out. Once that's done, I take the air compressor out again, spray out all the sawdust from in all the carve, just so I don't get any of that stuck in there when I lay down clear. This is always the most important part. Spraying the finish on and seeing that final vision come to life is what got me into woodworking, and it's what makes it all worth it. And you'll see just even on the back here how that wood just comes to life after being sanded and hit with another coat of lacquer. So once the backs are dry, I flip it back over to the front, and from here I'm going to take multiple passes with the lacquer, trying to get it enough built up so that it actually withstands having moisture on it. I'm going to go through and hit them from the sides as well. I don't think I show it quite as well as I should in this video, but what I do is, because I have it on these upside down paint can lids, I just rotate them little by little, and then once that dries, I hit it with a crumpled up paper bag, which kind of just polishes it out, gets the dust moved out, and brings a good luster to the finish. Now the final touch on these is putting a Cork Backer on these, so that it just doesn't slide around quite as much and doesn't make too much noise when you set it down. It's not necessary, but it definitely adds a little bit of professionalism to something like a coaster. And that is how I took a piece of scrap wood, turned it into coasters, and then plus a little bit of money, bought a Makita track saw.